From the New York Independent System Operator, this is the Power Trends podcast. We explore the forces shaping the electric grid and energy markets. And today we're going to take a close look at the renewable resources that help power the grid. More specifically, how wind and solar performed last year. We're going to focus on the annual NYISO Renewables Report. It's a resource that may be more relevant today than ever because we need more resources on the system. And this report, important, fascinating, because it offers us a clear data-driven look at how renewable resources like wind and solar are increasingly contributing to powering the grid, but also shows how their performance shifts by season, certain conditions, and technology. So the report highlights not only the growth in renewable output, but also the operational challenges and reliability needs that come along with integrating these resources. With wind generation reaching some new highs, behind the meter solar rapidly expanding, the findings show that maintaining a reliable grid requires more than just adding capacity. It takes that balanced mix, grid flexibility, certainly transmission investment that we've discussed on this podcast before. And there's no one better to help us break all this down than Udayan Nair, who serves as the Director of Grid Transition here at the NYISO. Udayan, pleasure to welcome you back. So let's just dive right in. At a high level, what does the 2025 renewable resources data tell us about wind, solar, their performance across New York compared to last year or 2024? And what do we need to know about this report?
Yeah, absolutely. Great place to start. So the story for the renewables has been one of continued growth, improving operational performance, and increasing relevance in the New York context. So let's start with, the suite of resources that we have, which really comprise of our solar and wind resources. So for solar resources, we have two different classes, what we call behind the meter solar resources. And people typically think of those as, things that are on people's rooftop, but they can be larger, up to about, 20 megawatts, which can power like significant amounts of load. And then we have front of the meter resources, which are the larger industrial type applications, for solar facilities. And then we also have our wind resources, which are primarily connected on the utility scale. Starting with solar, it's been a story of continued growth, and primarily actually in the space of behind the meter. So we had a goal in CLCP to reach 6,000 megawatts by 2025. We reached it ahead of that period of time. We were at over 6,800 megawatts of capacity last year. And we've grown by about 1,000 megawatts per year since 2020. So that's a remarkable success in terms of the capacity that has been added to the grid. When we look at the larger front of the meter installations, there too, additional capacity has been added. So we're at about 570-ish megawatts of capacity over there, pivoting a little bit into their performance actually. It was a great year in terms of the amount of output we got from these resources. So there was about a 15% year over year increase in the total amount of output when we're thinking about our behind the meter resources. And likewise, we almost doubled the amount of capacity or energy we got out of the front of the meter resources. So almost 1 terawatt hour for front of the meter and about 7 terawatt hours for behind the meter. And then moving on to our wind resources, there was no notable additions to our capacity. So our headline number in terms of total capacity is about 2,800 megawatts. That didn't change between 24 and 25. But even with the same amount of capacity, we did get increased production. And that was really on account of the more stronger wind patterns that we experienced. So the capacity factor of these resources increased. So that change in the absence of any capacity additions resulted in basically 15% more production, which is significant. So for a total of about 7 terawatt hours, and just maybe to put those numbers in some context, that's about 4.5% to 5% of New York's energy needs from wind, and then another 5% from solar.
So not adding additional wind turbines capacity, but getting more out of what is already there because of, like you said, some higher amounts of wind powering those turbines.
Absolutely.
So that utility scale or grid connected solar versus the behind the meter. Break that down again real quick.
The behind the meter solar is our fastest growing resource set right now. So we have over 6,800 megawatts of installed capacity on that. On the grid connected side, we have about 570, and those are typically the larger installations, which are hundreds of megawatts each. What we see is there is a difference in capacity factor for these types of resources, and that's really a function of the type of technology. So when we look at the front of the meter resources, they have higher capacity factors on average, and that's because typically they have dual axis tracking. So they can track the trajectory of the sun and adjust their tilt, which allows them to follow the sun more closely. But when we think of the things that are on rooftops, typically that is the angle of incidence. That's the way it's going to operate. So their performance tends to be lower. So their capacity factors are in about the 12% range. For the utility scale side, we're talking about between 18 and 20%.
And we get this question often, but let's walk through this. How do we account if it's the smaller installations that's producing most of the solar that we have today? How do we account for that in the control room? Because that's an important element that we need to know moment by moment.
Absolutely, Kevin. And that is a significant component, when we do our load forecasting. So the way we think of behind the meter resources, they're essentially like a load offset. So the amount of generation that we have to dispatch from the grid varies based on what the solar output is. So accounting for these resources is essential, and it's very, very critical. The challenge with it is because they're not connected to the bulk power system, they don't have any obligations to provide telemetry to the NYISO. So the way we account for their performance is essentially we worked with our forecast vendors. Our forecast vendors ingest information from inverter manufacturers and from these facilities to give a sampling of what their output is going to be. And then basically what we do is we have an inventory of where these resources are installed across the state. We use, the DPS databases, the NYSERDA databases, the standard interconnection resource databases. And so essentially we collate both those data sets. So looking at what is coming through from the sampling of sites, looking at where those sites are dispersed, and then scaling it up to the total amount of installed capacity and working with our forecast vendor is how we account for that. But certainly an area of growing focus and importance to us, again, just given the fact that how quickly these resources are growing and what a significant component they are part of the demand forecast.
So it sounds like a combination of some collaboration, coordination between us, DPS, NYSERDA, exchange the data, but then also significant software in order to create that calculation that's accurate enough for our control room operators to use in balancing supply with demand in the control room.
Absolutely. And it is certainly an area, where our demand forecasting team is actively engaged and continues to look at how do we do better? What are the other techniques that we can leverage, whether it be AI or machine learning or, those types of efforts to really bring greater visibility to this. So
one obvious question when we look at the breakdown between behind the meter and utility scale is why the vast difference, and how much more utility scale solar we think we can develop going forward. Why is one seemingly lagging behind the other? Any thoughts there?
One is in terms of when you look at it in terms of the rebates that were offered, and the availability to install these resources. If a developer comes to knocking on your doorstep and says, I can put a solar panel on your rooftop, pretty easily, save you some money, people are inclined to pursue that. So we have seen a lot of proliferation of, solar and residential sites. The other part is, again, when we're talking about utility scale solar, just like any other generation technology, it needs a footprint. And we're talking about then when you're talking about hundreds of megawatts, you're talking about large parcels of land. So then it gets into another prospect in terms of the siting and permitting challenges associated with it. So the proliferation of the smaller sites, again, from 20 megawatts or less has been very pronounced, I think, really on account of, the incentives that are offered, plus the expeditiousness of the siting and permitting process, which allow them to connect pretty quickly and come on the grid.
So the report also gives us some insight about curtailments. Curtailments in our real-time market, what drives those curtailments, and what investments have helped deliver more clean energy onto the grid. Let's explain to folks what curtailment is, maybe why it's used, and how that impacts renewable resources and what's outlined in the report.
Absolutely. So when we think about what curtailments are, essentially you're limiting the amount of production from a particular facility, and basically, where
And it
they
can
have
be
to.
any resource. I mean, it's an
Yeah.
operating tool as much as anything.
Absolutely. It could be a wind resource, a solar resource, or a fossil resource. There's a few factors that can drive curtailments. One of them is outages. Some of them could be, a local outage, a short-term outage just to do some equipment maintenance, which basically reduces the supply, the transfer capability of power because you have a transmission line out of service. When we think about Western New York, when we think about Segment A and Segment B, when we think about Smart Path Connect, these are some substantial public policy investments which are really intended to unbottle this energy and allow it to transfer from the generation sources back to the load sources. So these are projects that span, multiple years. So during that period of time, there is an impairment or a reduction in the total transfer capability. And these resources in those circumstances, if they're behind what we will call a congested interface, will be subject to curtailment. But overall, there has been a reduction in curtailment. So when we look in the earlier years in 2022, 2023, curtailments of wind energy were somewhere in the ballpark of about 3%. And that now has declined to about 1%, really because of the improvements that have been made. There still exists instances where there's congestion, but there's certainly less of them now.
Talking about transmission on the major high voltage transmission lines, and as you're outlining, segment A, segment B, these are big investments in new transmission. Gives us the better ability to move those electrons across the state. I think maybe just walk through quickly for folks. We've got plenty of wind resources in upstate New York, as one might imagine. In summer, high demand situations, we want to bring that energy down to the major load centers of New York City, Westchester County, and that's where that congestion can happen for trying to move all that energy at once down to where the demand is. That's where some curtailments can happen in those circumstances. We have that right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And curtailments can be a function on peak days, but they can be more pronounced in the shoulder season. So, and why is that? Well, that's because the load is lower. You have windy periods, coming out of your winter up until April. We start to get longer days, so you got a lot more solar production. And at the same time, people are not typically using their furnaces. They haven't switched on their ACs. So you have all of this renewable energy. You don't have as much load. And again, the concentration of where this energy is located typically, in conjunction with the transmission limitations, can lead to curtailments.
So to your point, we're recording this on Tuesday, May 5th. There's 2,029 megawatts as we speak of wind being produced for a current load of 14,457 megawatts. Can't tell how much solar is being produced, but it is sort of sunny out there and the leaves are still sort of off the trees. Like you say, it's the shoulder season, spring. So the sun is higher in the sky. There's not as much obstruction. It's fair to guess that we're getting a good amount of solar production today, but the load is low.
Yeah.
So it illustrates what you're talking about here.
When our loads are typically highest, we're talking about over 32,000 megawatts of demand. Wind production during those periods of time can be actually quite low. So the capacity factor of these resources, specifically wind, could be in the order of 10 to 12%. It has a far higher contribution during the period from October, let's say, to April. You can get over 40% capacity factor from it. Where solar complements that is, again, in the peak of summer, you get a lot more solar production. So that's when it actually performs strongest. But come the winter time, again, just because of shorter daylight hours, plus the impact of snow on panels, you get lower production from it. So while these resources, very important and an important part of our energy mix, I think the timing of that production is also an important factor that we have to account for, because we need to not only meet the energy needs, but we need to be able to supply that peak demand when people require it most.
So if we look at last summer's heat wave in June, for instance, there's pretty good solar production through that event over the course of those days to shave that daytime peak. But then what happened when the sun set? And the solar production tended to come off, we actually saw a load go into those evening hours continue to increase.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're going to see is as solar production ramps up and gets to its peak, typically around the midday mark, it from a grid operator's perspective, it looks like there's less load on the system, which isn't true, but that's the way we would dispatch our generation. Now, as you get into those evening hours, load is continuing to rise, but solar is actually dropping off. So you're seeing the output, continue to reduce until it gets to being dark. So that, as seen from the grid perspective, is basically manifesting itself as increasing load. And so what's happened is now our net load, our peak net load has actually shifted later into the evening hours, and that's really on account of the fact that that's when the sun is setting. That supply side resource, which was help offsetting demand, is no longer there. So the net impact is, it seems like you're getting to a peak load later in the evening.
Yeah, it really interesting. Not while it's happening, because it can cause some concern in the moment, but really interesting to take a look back at that. Maybe talk a little bit about that, and how storage can maybe fill some of that gap in maintaining reliability during those kinds of high demand events.
When you look at our interconnection queues, there's a lot of storage resources. There's solicitations that are being conducted by NYISO right now to procure more storage. And basically, that's what helps complement, the renewable profile of the resources. What storage resources allow the system operator to do, and will allow what the system to do, is be more responsible and flexible. So as solar comes up, typically you see a tempering effect on prices, because now, again, you have excess generation on the system. Prices tend to move a little bit lower. That's a great opportunity for storage resources to engage in price arbitrage. So essentially, they're charging when the prices are low. When that solar starts to taper off towards the evening peak, they can then discharge that energy and help meet those requirements during the evening peak. So there's that pattern of charge during the day and discharge over evening peak. But that pattern can also be repeated in the morning peak, which is, again, a significant increase in load that occurs, as people are going into work. So overnight, prices tend to be lower, which provides an opportunity for these storage resources to charge up, and over morning peak, subsequently discharge their output and be ready for, again, following that pattern later in the day. So they can play a vital balancing role and help manage some of that intermittency that's just as a consequence of the resources that are wind and solar.
So to your point, not a lot of storage on the system yet. So in the meantime, what do we see as filling that gap, especially for those extended high demand periods of time, absent that storage that can arbitrage between low and high prices and provide a meaningful contribution to that demand scenario?
Right now in New York is we're relying on our aging generation fleet, which is primarily fossil-based generation. Over 60% of our capacity is fossil-based. So that has the flexibility to start up on short notice, and provide this ramping capability, which is not only provide energy for those peak periods of time, but to be able to move from period where demand is low to a period where demand is high. There's additional flexibility provided by resources such as hydro, but again, just in terms of their total capacity, they're not as large a proportion of our system load. So fossil resources are really doing the heavy lifting, to really supply that evening peak load and sort of balance out that intermittency that's created by wind and solar right now.
So they're in many cases older, beyond their expected industry life. But we're relying on them more because demand is going up over time.
It's one of the oldest fleets, if not the oldest fleet in the nation. And when we look at where demand is trending, they're going to be called on more frequently to provide that power. We're seeing summer demands increase, as a consequence of, electrification, but large loads coming on the system. And likewise in the winter, that rate of increase is even more pronounced because you need to be able to supply that energy. And you're also electrifying your heating appliances. So you're moving away from furnaces, you're moving towards heat pumps. People are driving more EVs. So in total, the net amount of energy demand is going to increase. And when we think of what the cold spell that we experienced most recently, which we just came out of this year, really 19 days of deep cold. Solar and wind resources were important. They provided, about 500,000 megawatt hours of energy, but, over 2 million megawatt hours of energy was provided by resources, that use liquid fuels. And we're talking about our fossil resources. So really, you need to have that reliable backstop that can be able to provide power when it's needed.
So that sounds like you're highlighting that all of the above investment approach that's necessary here. We want to develop all of these resources, and we want to make sure that the aging fleet is updated or upgraded at the same time that we're investing in additional renewables.
Absolutely. It was and it continues to be all of the above approach. Every megawatt is helpful, every megawatt is beneficial to help serve the needs. But really, you need a complementary suite of technologies to help with not just the energy needs, not just the capacity needs, but things like ramping, things like inertia, voltage control. So to provide that whole host of services, you need, all of these resources, as well as flexibility from future loads as well, because that also can be part of the solution mix.
Okay, so let's dive into that a little bit. You've accounted for what's driving demand that we've experienced and have had to address till now, electrification of the building and transportation sectors. But we know that there's a lot of large loads that are expected, a lot of projects that are in our queue. So I think it's interesting and helpful. We get this question a lot. If we compare ourselves with Texas, which also sees a lot of large load development, why and what are the differences between Texas and New York that show we're not accelerating the investment on the resource side to meet what we anticipate will be those increased large loads, while Texas just keeps building on both sides, new large loads of various different types and a lot of new generation. When somebody asks you that question, what's the difference?
It's a great question. And, there's similarities between New York and Texas, but there's also quite a few differences. Since we're talking about wind and solar, they've had a very ambitious build out and very successful build out. But Texas has access to vast swaths of open land, where you can build these resources relatively quickly. At the same time, when we look at the abundance of, the fuels that power these resources, the sun and the wind. So, when we look at Texas, they have strong wind performance in, especially in the Panhandle and those types of areas. So essentially what you're seeing is, the same type of resource, a wind resource, may have a capacity factor of, 25 to 30% over here. They can have a capacity factor of 40 to 45% in Texas. So we're talking about, 50% increase in the total amount of production. So certainly an attractive place where you would want to build these resources because they're working a lot harder for you and they're running much more frequently. And likewise, capacity factors tend to be between 25 to 30% for solar resources in that area. And that too is because the sun has a stronger radiance, the further south you move. So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is, they're not hindered by winter, so when we think about winter, you have snow on panels, you have less production. So that's why the renewable side of the equation looks a little bit different in Texas than it does over here. In terms of when we think about the large load development, siting, permitting, all of those rules and regulations are quite different in the Texas landscape in New York. So something to consider. But recognizing that as these loads are coming, even in places like Texas, load flexibility is a very essential feature for these loads to be able to connect. Because on those peak days, there may not be enough power to be able to supply all of them. And so that's why really creating the mechanisms and the incentives for these loads to participate. And I would say on that frame, New York implemented the first of its kind DER framework back in 2024, which is really a big effort, in this direction.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you're highlighting here is the importance of location. if West Texas has a lot of wind, there's not a lot of, I mean, think about the geography and the geology. It's unobstructed wind, so they can harvest more. By the way, population in West Texas, not what it is in the western part of our state. Let's just put it that way. But their build out on both load and demand side certainly has an impact on how they are managing reliability. A few words about that. Our capacity market at its basic level is a reliability tool, element, construct. They don't have that there. So their control room operators' experience is vastly different on a day-by-day basis with all of this growing demand and growing load. Just a couple of thoughts based on your expertise, Udayan, of what those differences must be like between, how we approach reliability, balancing load with supply moment to moment, and how they're doing things with all of that growth in Texas.
Yeah, certainly the way they're approaching this is, releasing and, architecting a new set of ancillary services really to account for this. So when we think about our system, we have our operating reserve, which helps meet, these variations. But even to that effort, as we're seeing larger penetrations of wind and solar resources, we have an internal effort, a market effort to introduce a new ancillary service into the market called the Balancing Intermittency Reserve product, essentially. And that's going to account for the net uncertainty that's created by load ramps, by wind and solar, and in tandem, project what is the additional amount of reserve we need to carry to be able to manage these types of instances. And so in the context of Texas, they too have rolled out a suite of new ancillary services which help them balance load and supply. And also, when we're thinking about it now, the other aspect that's becoming more important is not just capacity to meet load over the course of an hour. We're talking about over a multi-hour period, where loads can stay elevated. And there could be a wind lull, there could be a solar lull, both of those could happen in tandem. So to have products that can sustain their output for a longer duration is an important feature. And by creating a market construct for that, you're really incentivizing those types of resources to connect to the system, which could include things like longer duration storage, thinking about 4 hours plus worth of storage from a facility.
Is the simplest way to distill down the development of those ancillary services, or one way to, is an attempt to mitigate uncertainty going forward as we transition both on large load, but also resource development?
Absolutely, because what we could do where we continue to try and improve is forecasting uncertainty. We will never be able to eliminate uncertainty. It's just a function of, when the sun shines or the wind blows, but to have that foresight as to what are the periods in which there's a higher likelihood that this forecast is going to be missed or it's going to be wrong, and then looking at it in tandem with what we have on the supply side that can help fill that gap at that same point in time, and looking at what loads are. So essentially to look at that composite picture in its totality, and then to be able to manage for those situations. That's really a lot of the efforts that we're undertaking, improving forecasting, developing tools for better visibility, and basically unifying it to come up with a good set of decisions.
So back to the report, we'll wrap it up here in a second. What really stands out that you want to communicate to our listeners and about the importance here, and then the significant takeaways from last year, and what we might look for going into this year?
It has been a story of continued growth. There has been progress across all fronts, and it has certainly been in the right direction, and it has been helpful in addressing the energy needs that we're foreseeing in the future. However, we need even more resources to connect to the system to really be able to meet the demands that are going to be placed on us, because as important as electricity is today, it's going to be more imperative tomorrow when we power our homes with it, get to and from work with it, and essentially power more of our lifestyle.
Perfect. Udayan, thanks so much for helping break this down, providing that summary and the insights into resource development that's so sorely needed here. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me on the show.
And for more conversations like this covering grid reliability markets, competitive electric markets, the evolving grid, be sure to subscribe to Power Trends wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.